setting a good example for our students when we continue to learn.
Yeah. Oh, top. And you are? Okay. Nice to meet you. Okay. Whatever you want. You go. Are you taking off the test?
Setting a good. Okay. That is set up on YouTube, and now we'll just wait a second and let a few more people log in. I'll just give a heads up here, though, at the start that next Wednesday I am taking the day off because my kids will be on spring break, and so we're going to spend Tuesday and Wednesday together. So there will be no classes next Wednesday. I'll try and mention that again at the end of the day, or the end of the class.
Enjoy with them, especially now that will be the last year that you will have both of them together.
At least that I can count on. You know, I'm hoping that my daughter will still visit me from time to time, but it won't be quite as easy to schedule.
Yeah. Did she receive any answer from any university?
Oh yeah, she's got about 3 or 4 that she's considering now.
Oh, nice. Nice.
So we'll see what she wants to do once we'll sit down and go through all of them. There's still a couple more that she's waiting to hear from before we've got to make final decisions.
So when she received the answer from them, also is reading the scholarship, how much and everything, or just yes or no?
Well, some and some. So some of them sent the acceptance and the financial aid package. Some of them sent just the acceptance, and we're waiting to hear the financial aid side.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. Every college has their own schedule.
Yeah.
All right. I think we have given our usual cushion, and like I said, we've got people on Zoom, people on YouTube. So let's go ahead and get rolling. Oh, hold on. One more person to admit into the room. All right. So we are here at the end of Exodus. We are here in chapter 38, for those of you keeping score, at the beginning of the Torah portion of Pekudei. This week is a double Torah portion, and we're going to pick up with the second Torah portion beginning. And you might be wondering to yourself, do we really have to talk about the building of the Mishkan again? If you've been keeping score and you've been reading through all of your parshiot, which you definitely should, you may be a little bit tired about hearing about the sockets and the altars and the cloths and all of the different things. So, I have to warn you, yes, we are going to talk about the construction, but we're going to be talking about it in a slightly different way than we have before. And I hope that you'll find in it things that are interesting, not just about the ancient world, but also things that we can use from it that are still applicable to our approach to life for ourselves and our communities. So it's a tall order, I know, because not everyone enjoys this particular Torah portion, but I am very confident the Torah in all of its passages has something to teach all of us, and not only an ancient architecture lesson. So, with that in mind, let's see what the Torah has to say about this. And in Pekudei, we can see that this is the final accounting of the construction. And this Torah portion begins in chapter 38, verse 21. These are the records of the tabernacle of the pact. It's one of the other names of the Mishkan. There's Mishkan as well as Mishkan Ha'edut, the covenant, not literally the covenant, the record of the covenant, the pact, which were drawn up at Moses' bidding, meaning that this accounting was drawn up. The work of the Levites under the direction of Itamar, son of Aaron the priest. So this might sound like we're just going to begin a boring audit report. We are beginning an audit report, but it's not boring. Now, Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, had made all that the Lord had commanded Moses. We had seen his appointment earlier on. At his side was Oholiab, son of Ahishamach, of the tribe of Dan, carver and designer, embroiderer in blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and in fine linen. So this is reminding us that not only was there Bezalel, who was from Judah, but also there was Oholiab from Dan. One of the midrashim on this reminds us then that one of the people who was chief was from the largest tribe, and one of them who was chief was from one of the smallest tribes, meaning that there was greatness from all of our people, whether they were large or small. And, of course, others had been working together with them. These were the foremen, if you will, of the project. All the gold that was used for the work, in all the work of the sanctuary, the elevation offering of gold, came to 29 talents and 730 shekels by the sanctuary weight. Now this phrase, shekel hakodesh, we will come back to. So for the moment, just understand that if you think that the imperial system of weights and measures with ounces and pounds and tons is a little confusing and not intuitive, especially compared to the metric system of doing weights, this system is even more bizarre. Now, it's bizarre for the very good reason that people tried to weigh things according to baselines that could be referenced in the natural world around them, and then rough standardizations developed afterwards. But it's still going to make it complicated. We are going to have to do just a little math eventually to get the full impact of all of this, but just bear with me. So, the gold came to 29 talents and 730 shekels by the sanctuary weight. The silver of those of the community who were recorded came to 100 talents and 1,775 shekels by the sanctuary weight. A half shekel a head, half a shekel by the sanctuary weight, for each one who was entered in the records from the age of 20 years up. 603,550 men. And I've done other videos talking about the census, but this is reminding us of that half shekel that was taken for each of these people. The 100 talents of silver were for casting the sockets of the sanctuary and the sockets of the curtain. 100 sockets to the 100 talents. Oh, someone accidentally accessed the annotation. Let me just remove that so that we can have a nice clean screen. And hold on a second. I'm going to just remove that so no one accidentally does it again. Okay. The 100 talents, a talent a socket, meaning a talent of silver was used for each of the sockets. And of the 1,775 shekels, he made hooks for the posts, overlays for their tops, and bands around them. The copper from the elevation offering came to 70 talents and 2,400 shekels. Of it he made the sockets for the entrance of the tent of meeting, the copper altar, and its copper grating, and all the utensils of the altar. The sockets of the enclosure round about, and the sockets of the gate of the enclosure, and all the pegs of the tabernacle, and all the pegs of the enclosure round about. All right, we're going to stop there, because that's probably as much counting and metal description as most people can stomach in a short amount, and it will give us our launching point. But first of all, I want to draw your attention to something that the commentators spend a lot of time on, which we're not going to, but it's still important to have in our mind, which is one of these things is not like the other. We've talked about gold, we've talked about silver, we've talked about copper, but one of these things is not handled in the same way in its description. Now, I know your eyes may be glazing over with the numbers, but that's when we have to be very careful of how we are reading. And what the commentators point out is that if you look back in verse 24, where it talks about the total weight of the gold, and you compare that to verses 25, 26, and 27, where it starts talking about the silver, the gold doesn't tell us what was made with it. The silver, we get in accounting. made the sockets, made the hooks, made the overlay for their tops, the bands around them. And likewise for the copper, we are told what is made with the copper. But the gold is not explained precisely what was made with them. And the general explanation that many of the commentators give is that the gold was not broken down into as much detail in its description, because most of the objects, apart from one very special exception, were not made only from gold. They were usually made from wood that had an overlay around it. And that, of course, means that the estimation is a little different, and we have to go back to each of those in its specific description to know how much gold was used for each. Because if you said that a talent of gold was used for the aron, for the ark, then that might make a person think that it was solid gold. But of course it wasn't. It was wood with gold inside and gold out. So the gold accounting had to wait for the other sections that go into much more detail of exactly how much gold was used in different places. Okay. Before we jump into how in the world this ancient building accounting book is going to be relevant to us, are there any general questions that people would like to ask? Okay, I'm not seeing anything on YouTube, not seeing anything on Zoom. Like I thought, this is not exactly a piece of text that stirs the blood and makes us wish for more understanding. So, hopefully, you'll be in for a treat as we begin to see what indeed our sages have tried to teach us from this. Just move things to make it a little bit easier to read. At least on my screen. So beginning with Sforno. The contributions of gold, silver, and copper for the building of the tabernacle were minuscule compared to the amount which was used in the building of King Solomon's temple. We read in Kings 1, chapter 6, verses 20 to 35, and also chapter 7, 45 to 50, about the opulence of that structure. Just massive, massive quantities of gold and other precious items that were used in its construction, dwarfing what was used in the building of the Mishkan. It was a much larger building after all. Compared to the restoration of the Second Temple in the days of Herod, even Solomon's temple could be considered a poor attempt at impressing the world with the Jewish people's wealth. I often find it ironic that many of the models you see people sharing of the Second Temple are the models that were based on the renovations done by Herod, as described in the rabbinic literature from those later days of the Second Temple period. The original Second Temple was a much more modest building, and it was modest especially compared to Solomon's temple. But in the days of Herod, who never saw a building project he didn't like, he renovated the temple to make it a more magnificent, in quotes, example of his stature. The people in the day didn't mind too much because it was also celebrating God, but Herod, we must understand, really built it in order to get more credit for himself, not really for God. So when we have those comparisons, taken from rabbinic literature and taken from the Tanakh, and then we see the Mishkan, these numbers, which might sound large to us modern day people who are not usually involved in major gold building projects, might seem a little pathetic. Like, really? This is so amazing that you had to write down all the details? Is this what you're bragging about, of what you built? Sforno explains, despite all the material wealth invested in Solomon and Herod's temples, Moses' tabernacle, a collapsible structure, it was just a tent that was moved after all, enjoyed far more of God's presence than Solomon's, not to mention the Second Temple, in which the presence of God was never manifest. The rabbis explain that unlike the dedication of Solomon's temple, where there was an obvious and visible sign of God's presence, that the Second Temple never enjoyed that same status. So the Mishkan, which was built with the, in quote, cheapest materials, seems to have had the best presence of God available, the most palpable, the most perceptible presence of God. All of these historical facts teach us that material wealth, even if donated generously, is not a major factor in the success of a temple dedicated to the house of the presence of God on earth. God's presence depends on his approval of the lives of those who have built such a temple for him. So, what Sforno is trying to clarify for us by comparing all of the different accounting that we see in the different texts is that although you, the average person, might be impressed by the quantity of gold or silver or stone or cypress or other precious materials, God is not so easily impressed. God did not show greater favor to the second temple under Herod than he did to Solomon or than he did to the Mishkan, just because Herod's temple was more expensive to build. Instead, God's presence seems to have been more clearly felt based upon the people that actually used the temple, that built the temple. And that is something that is really important to remember as we read through these last few chapters of the book of Exodus. That the Mishkan and then later the temples which succeeded it were not designed as display pieces. This was not designed to impress people the way a golden temple or a giant cathedral in our own world might have been built. But instead it was designed as a way for people to draw close to God. And the amount of gold was not the thing that mattered most. Instead, it was the quality of the people that would create a stronger feeling of God's presence, not just the quantity of gold. So it was how people used it. And indeed, this continues to this day. I have been in small communities with modest buildings, sometimes even in people's houses, where you could feel the passion of the community and thus feel a closeness to God that was far and away different than what I felt when I have been in some of the most opulent and architecturally impressive buildings in the world, whether it be the Vatican or other cathedrals, or whether it be Jewish buildings that were made in elaborate style and obviously with great expense, but unfortunately did not always house a community which reflected the actual brilliance of Torah and thus the brilliance of God. So, what Sforno was putting on the table for us right at the start is we should not think of these lists as just as an attempt to impress us. For indeed, this list is not going to be impressive compared to other buildings. Therefore, we have to understand this list is designed to impress us with the people, not with the materials. With that in mind, we are going to look at the materials in more detail, because even though that's not there to impress us, it must be teaching us something. More than just the price tag, it's got to be teaching us something. Any question on Sforno's explanation here? All right, then let's go ahead and move into Or HaChaim, who begins to give us one of our explanations of what might be happening here. The Torah wishes to underline that all the gold handed over to the various artisans, not an ounce remained unaccounted for. It was all used up in the construction of the vessels which were to be made of gold. The whole verse then is testimony to the integrity of the artisans employed in fashioning all the parts made of gold. So the first thing he wants to draw our attention to is that when you compare the amount donated to the amount used, it is the same. And that is telling us that there was no overhead cost. There was no additional price that was being paid to the workers, but instead, everything that was donated for the Mishkan went into building the Mishkan and its items. And you can compare the ledger. The same in, the same out, the same in, the same used, and you know that no one was taking extra for themselves, that no one was skimming off the top. And indeed, we're going to talk about that in more detail in just a second, but I want to bring his second comment, which explains why this is even more impressive. The Torah may also allude to miracles which occurred to the gold. When one constructs vessels out of metal, the fact that it has to be melted down and worked in other ways, etc., results in some loss of the original amount. I don't know if any of you have ever done any metal casting or ever done even any woodworking or have ever done any sewing and fabric use or knitting, but the amount of material you buy is always greater than the amount of the material in the final product. There is always a loss. I know from woodworking, which I've done a lot more than metalworking, that if I am sawing up a plank of wood, at the very least, the space the saw goes through, which is turned into sawdust, is not going to be in the final product. And likewise, if I have to trim something, then it ends up with the extra bits being trimmed off, not in the final product. But here, we are being told by Sforno that when we see that the same amount that was donated is the same amount that was used, we should recognize in that something special was happening. As he points out, the more the original lump of gold had to be divided in order to construct all the various smaller parts made of gold, the greater the percentage lost. The Torah testifies here that there was absolutely no wastage. All the original material was used up fully to become part of the sacred work. The miracle was noticeable only because there was neither excess nor shortage during any stage of the construction of the many items required for the project. If there had been a shortage, for example, then we would have needed a record of more having been donated, or we would have had a record of more having been created in order to say that yes, this much was donated, but this much plus one was actually made. Likewise, if there had been excess, it would have said this much was donated and this much was made, x minus 1, implying that there was a little bit left over. Instead, by having the two amounts referred to in a way that implies their equality, we can respect that something special was happening during this construction to avoid any loss of the materials that had been donated, and to make sure that every person's gift actually went into the construction of the Mishkan. Now, this is a topic that's a little confusing and very counter to modern fundraising. I remember in Baltimore talking with a group of teens about funding synagogues and how all of that worked. They were a little surprised that when someone donated to the Siddur Fund in our conversation, that not 100% of the money went to buy a book, but that instead some of the money went to shipping, some of the money went to the overhead of the synagogue to make sure that we would be able to still buy a Siddur and use a Siddur. But in the modern world, that is the way it works now. There's still no wastage. All the money goes for the actual service of the community, but it is a different way of looking at it. In this point in our history, where all we were doing was building the Mishkan, it was an easier way to preserve every ounce in was an ounce that came out in the result. Any questions or comments on the way Sforno is reminding us to be extremely careful with what is given to us to make sure that we use all of it for the proper purpose?
I have a question.
Yes.
How much gold did they leave Egypt with if they had already made the golden calf and there was still enough gold to do this?
So they left with quite a lot. One of the things that we know from when they were leaving Egypt was that the Egyptians gave them gifts as they left, that they were actually enriched by the Egyptians on their departure, which of course parallels the experiences of the earlier Avot, with Abraham and Isaac also being enriched when they had to depart under poor treatment. So there was an enrichment, and they definitely went out with a lot. And the golden calf is not considered to have been enormous. It wasn't 20 foot high, but was a more modest construction. In fact, it was made up of just the sort of personal jewelry, rather than any additional gold that people might have had in other store. Any other questions or comments? All right. Then we move on to Chizkuni. Let me just get him up. Don't scroll too far. Let him get him into place. The Torah spells out what exactly all the silver and copper donated was used for. The reason for this is that the silver was used as a ransom for the people who had somehow become guilty during the episode of the golden calf. The reason why the Torah does not enumerate the detail for what the gold was used for is that no item was made wholly of gold except for the candlestick, the menorah, and the cover for the ark. All the other furnishings were only overlaid with gold, as I talked about before. But the first half is what we want to focus on a little bit here. That the idea here that the Torah has said that the silver was used specifically as a ransom, as an atonement for the people who had become guilty during the episode of the golden calf, is hearkening towards the idea that the people did have another penalty, which was to give a half shekel. And that half shekel and the math that comes with it is something that we're going to get to. But first, we need to talk a little bit more about how the people would have been handling this whole process of the donation, and what we can see from it as a modern behavior practice. Let me make sure that I don't think I can get both parts on the screen, so we're just going to have to scroll when we get to the second half. Just as a person must be able to face God with a clear conscience, so it is important to appear unblemished in the eyes of the people. When addressing this subject, our sages in Shekalim postulate that the donors, when delivering their mandatory contribution, must not enter the office designated for receiving the same while wearing clothes which could conceal the money in its folds. That is, in order that in the event such people become wealthy sometimes afterwards, they could not be accused of having helped themselves to the money stored in the office. Even if such a person was a wealthy man, he is not allowed to wear this kind of clothing, so that should he become a poor afterwards, people might say that he was being punished for misappropriating funds from the office. So what he's trying to say here, well, what the Mishnah is trying to say that he is bringing, is that yes, we know that it's important that we not do anything that God says we shouldn't do. Of course, it's obvious that's what a mitzvah is. That's what a commandment means, that we should be able to stand before God and know in our heart we have done nothing wrong. However, it's also important, say our sages, that the people around us do not think that we have done something wrong. And sometimes that means we have to behave in a way that is additionally cautious to make sure that we could not even be suspected of having done something wrong. For example, when a person is coming in to drop off their contribution, they have to make sure they're not wearing some sort of billowy clothing that could easily be used as a bag for removing money from that office, meaning that it wouldn't be so easy for them to steal. That way, when they go in and when they come out, people will not be able to suspect them of having taken anything. And in the beautiful rabbinic logic of understanding human psychology, they say this is twofold, because if a person becomes rich after leaving, people will think, aha, he stole the money, that's how he got rich. Even if it's not true, and even if you have a clear conscience in your mind, you did behave in a way which made it at least possible for someone to suspect that. But, and this is the part I love, if the person is rich, you might think, well, they don't need to worry about how they're dressed, because if they're rich, no one will think of them as stealing. But they argue that if the person who is rich was still wearing that easily clothes that you could easily conceal the money in, if they became poor afterwards, then people would blame them for having stolen and say that their poverty was a punishment. So whether you become rich or whether you become poor, people can still be suspicious of you if you give them the excuse. If you leave that opening, it doesn't matter whether you have good fortune or bad fortune. If somebody is looking for a way to blame you because you did something in a way that was suspicious, they will find a way to blame you. So better to remove that opportunity for suspicion. Better to remove that issue. As he goes on to summarize, people must always be on guard to conduct themselves in such a fashion that they do not arouse suspicions in their fellow men that they have been guilty of some misdemeanor. David already prayed to God that this should not happen when he said, You have saved me from the strife of peoples, implying that that is talking about the suspicion of other people. There is an even more specific verse in the Torah concerning this subject in Numbers 32. You will be clear before the Lord and before Israel, talking about the tribes who stayed over on the eastern side of the Jordan River during the invasion of the land of Canaan, that since they were willing to send their troops, that the rest of Israel would be willing to allow them to keep those portions on the eastern side. And as the text there says, by coming and having your troops with us, you will be clear before the Lord, which seems like the obvious thing to worry about, and before Israel, meaning that yes, we also have an obligation to make sure that we do not give cause to rouse suspicion in others of our behavior. Even if we know what we're doing is right, we still need to be extra careful to prevent that. We also have an explicit verse about this subject in Proverbs 3:4, and you will find favor and high esteem in the eyes of God and man, meaning that indeed we make sure that our behavior is correct, beyond reproach and beyond suspicion. And this is another explanation, say additional commentaries, which wouldn't fit on the page, that why the accounting of the Mishkan is so important, because we wanted to make sure that everybody understood that what Moses did, what Bezalel did, what Oliav did, what all the people did with using of this wealth to build the Mishkan was entirely above board and perfectly clear and honest. And having open and transparent accounting is the example that we can use for ourselves in our own life or in our own community affairs to make sure that there is full transparency. It's one thing that I'm personally very proud of and was very drawn to when I came to Temple Israel, with the idea that our budgets and our records are incredibly clear. Our board meetings are open to any who would like to attend, although only appointed board members can vote. That way we are saying we have nothing to hide. What we do is available for all to see and all to review to be sure that we are being good stewards of our community. Questions or comments?
I have a question, Rabbi, about the Numbers and the Proverbs verses. Is that a plural you or a singular you?
That's a good question. I would have to do a quick double check on that. Give me a second. Because unfortunately English does not tell us that. But Hebrew will. So if you give me 2 seconds to look that back up again. If I can spell.
And while you're looking it up, is it because if it's plural, it implies something that's important for the entire community.
Well, in terms of the plural, in terms of who is it that's finding favor, it's a singular favor that's being found, but the eyes are of course a plural eyes, which could either refer to the plurality of God and Adam, humanity, or could refer to God and humanity as the plural.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments? All right, then we're gonna head into the Atzakenim before looping back on the math. But I wanted to give you, for those of you that are not accounting majors or mathematicians or people interested in the parts we've discussed so far, another way of looking at the Mishkan in general. It doesn't have anything to do with the materials, but has to do with its overall structure that can somehow, I hope, make this feel a bit more relatable in a spiritual way. So he says, it is worthwhile to reflect on how many of the details surrounding the Mishkan reflect creation. And by creation he means Maaseh Bereshit, the act of creation found at the beginning of the Torah. On the first day, God created heaven and earth, which is described in Psalms 104:2 as spreading the heavens like a carpet, being spread out, which corresponds to when the Mishkan's walls were covered with goat skins. On the second day, God had created the Rakia, often called the firmament, and divided the lower waters from the upper waters. This matches the installation of the dividing curtain, the parochet. On the third day, the earth beneath the oceans formed a surface and became visible above the waters. This parallels the making of the water basin, the kior, used by the priests. On the fourth day, God positioned the luminaries in the sky. This matches the making and placing of the menorah in the tabernacle and kindling it. On the fifth day, God created the fish and the birds, and the corresponding activity was the winged cherubs, which were placed on the cover of the Holy Ark. On the sixth day, God created the first human being. This is reflected in the order to Moses to consecrate his brother Aaron as high priest. And on the seventh day, God had rested. This is equal to what is said in Exodus 39:43, all the work of constructing the tabernacle was completed. So what he's trying to say is that when you look at the Mishkan and all of its elements, you shouldn't see them as just being a random assortment, but instead should see in them a parallel to creation itself. Because indeed, the idea of the Mishkan, the idea that we can connect to God's presence, that we can feel close to God, indeed, anywhere that we go, when we constructed the Mishkan, reminding us that God is throughout the world, this is something for which the world was created. The world wasn't created just to be a biological experiment. The world was created so that one day there would be people who had enough of a mind and a soul to be able to feel God's presence and to reach out and connect. And the Mishkan symbolizes that ultimate effort, and the Mishkan, as symbolizing a connection to creation, reminds us that this is the point of creation. That creation is not just here so that we can live, work, and die, but that creation is here so that we can live, reach, strive towards God, and create a transformation in our soul that will far outlast this particular earthly existence. Questions or comments on Da'at Zekenim's interpretation there? All right, quiet class today. All right, so let's go ahead. I cannot get this all on one screen, so we're going to have to scroll. Let's go ahead and get to the hard stuff. Let's get to the math. First, the half shekel of the 600,000 men older than 20 came to 300,000 shekels, which would be 100 talents, a talent, each talent having 3,000 shekels. So this was the way that the math worked in the ancient world for their counting. Rashi computes the numbers as follows. A talent equals 60 manah. Seeing that shekels being counted were described as holy shekels, which we talked about in our first reading, they were considered to be double the weight of an ordinary shekel. And Rashi gives more explanation of why in his commentary. A talent then would be equivalent to 120 manah. Right? Usually 60 talents would be, one talent would be equal to 60, but because these are holy shekels, now it's going to be a talent is equal to 120. Now, the manah is equivalent to 25 silayim. This gives you the amount of 3,000 shekels per talent. So this is his complicated way of handling all that math. Now, you do not need to follow all of that. You just need to understand that according to this calculation, using the holy shekel as a double weight, which is based off Bechorot in the Talmud, that you end up with a formula where 3,000 shekels will equal 1 talent. Okay. Having established all of this, we can now address the amount of silver Haman offered to pay King Ahasuerus in exchange to destroy the Jews. He offered 10,000 talents of silver, which was equal to 50 shekels for every Jew, assuming that there had been 600,000 Jews at the time. So what he is trying to say is, isn't it a little coincidental that the amount of silver that was being offered by Haman works out to be 50 shekels per Jew, if we assume there were 600,000 Jews at the time, which may or may not be a good demographic assumption, but the math works out rather specifically to be an equal amount to the number of people that were found in the census during the wilderness. And in fact, that number 50 has its own significance. It is the maximum amount per adult male between the ages of 20 and 60 prescribed by the Torah, Leviticus 27, that someone donating his own equivalent to God has to give to the temple treasury. We've talked in previous classes about this so-called erech vow, where a person would give their valuation as a specific kind of donation to the temple. So 50 times the appropriate talents that Haman is offering works out to be 600,000. Now, if that particular calculation does not impress you, if you do not see this as being that Haman is offering the amount equal to even the highest number per person, then how about a second way of reading it? Another way of understanding why Haman picked this amount may be that when the brothers sold Joseph and received 20 pieces of silver in exchange, which in the exchange rate of the day would have been equal to 5 shekels, that would mean half a shekel each. There were 10 brothers involved in the sale. Benjamin wasn't there. Joseph was being sold, leaving 10 other brothers who were involved in the sale. And that means that they each would have received half a shekel. 5 shekels, 10 brothers, 0.5 shekel per person. He concluded that in exchange for the amount he offered, he could legally make all the Jews his slaves. Indeed, going by that same 600,000 assumption. So he was literally purchasing the Israelites for a value that would have been the amount that each of the brothers felt was sufficient to justify for themselves the selling of their brother. So if we are willing to sell our brother for half a shekel, then certainly Haman can buy us for half a shekel. He concluded that in exchange, so he concluded that this would make them his slaves, and then he could do what he wanted. He felt certain that he would succeed, seeing that the brothers had never been punished by God for selling Joseph into slavery. There is no explicit description of a punishment for the brothers, although many other teachings have been taught about that. He reasoned similar to what we find in Midrash Tehillim 10, that because the brothers sat down to eat their meal after throwing Joseph into the pit, but before selling him, acting as if nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred, God was so angry that he said, "Seeing you have sold your brother as a result of feasting, your descendants will be sold as a result of having feasted," meaning participating in the banquet given by King Ahasuerus. There are many rabbinic opinions that say that the problems that came upon us during the time of Ahasuerus at the hand of Haman were a type of punishment because we had attended and gladly participated in Ahasuerus' banqueting that is described at the beginning of the story. We should have refrained and not indulged in what he was offering. So the idea here is tit for tat. You are willing to sit down and with Ahasuerus, just as your brothers were willing to sit down and sell their brother. Well, just as they had a problem for themselves, you are going to have a problem as a result as well. This is why, he argues, the book of Esther makes such a point of telling us that the king and Haman sat down to feast after having concluded the deal in which Haman acquired authority to do to the Jews whatever he wanted, which has always, in my mind, struck me as odd, and one thing that I really appreciate this midrash of giving me a way to interpret, which is, why does it say that they sat down to feast after having made the deal? Because it parallels the callousness with which the brothers sat down to feast, having dealt with their own brother Joseph. And what goes around comes around, or midah keneged midah, as we say in the Hebrew idea, that a long-term justice was being done. Not necessarily punishing the descendants of the brothers, but instead saying that the same way that they valued their brother's life at only half a shekel, so too their lives are going to be valued at half a shekel by their enemy. And we should not be surprised that others will take us up on our own valuation of one another. That even though we may not have intended that as being the price tag that we would set on our lives, because that is how we treated our own, we shouldn't be surprised that others would treat us the same way when they had a problem with us. Going back to that whole idea of allowing or of ensuring that our behavior is beyond reproach, that our behavior is beyond suspicion, we can see that when we behave in terrible ways, even if we can clean up the problem in our own life, others may have witnessed it, and that may lead to problems in their life, in our whole community, or coming back, maybe even at a later date, onto our own heads. We need to make sure that we're keeping count, not just of the gold, but of each other, and we need to make sure that we're treating each other as precious, because if we don't, others will notice, and they will treat us the way we treat each other. So any questions or comments before we finish for today? Hopefully you've seen that there's a lot more going on here than just basic accounting, and that each of these verses and the different ideas within them are portals to a much more thinking and learning and many more insights from our tradition. So don't just skip the pages, take a moment, sit down, see what might be going on below that surface.
Where can we find the pages? Because there, I like some of the comments, and I read them in the other place, but I like that they are all together.
I mean, where can you find the handout?
Yes.
The handout is found in my Dropbox link, which is on the front of my channel, which has every handout I've done for every Torah class for the last 10 years.
In the front of your channel on YouTube,
if you go to like the actual channel page, hold on a second, I can maybe bring that up. Let me see. Hold on, go to YouTube.
I went many times to the channel, but I never saw that there's
right, but you need to go to the About section. Let's see if I can find myself. There I am. Okay. So if you go to the channel page for myself and you go to About, there is the link for the Dropbox. I can put it in the Zoom chat as well for those that maybe have a little more difficulty. And that, like I said, is the link to every handout I've done for the Torah classes for the last 10 years.
Good to know. Better later than never.
Well, and I'll keep adding to it, and they're all numbered, so you can look up the most recent one, or you can just search in the Dropbox by the name of the Torah portion to find the handouts for that particular topic.
Thank you, Rabbi Yasher Koach, for
You're welcome, and thank you for letting me remind people about that resource.
Rabbi,
Yes,
just a quick observation. The theme about the brothers calmly sitting down to lunch after selling Joseph, this is a theme we see regularly in the secular legal world, where someone is charged with and it's been, then even after they're convicted, of course, of some heinous crime, prosecutors will regularly argue in terms of both before the jury and especially before a judge when it comes time for sentencing, that not only did this defendant commit this horrible murder, this horrible rape, whatever it is, then calmly went to a party or went, was just playing softball in the park as if this were just another day, and didn't even outwardly show the slightest bit of anguish of maybe I did something wrong here. And so we see it when reporters write about crimes like that. This is a common theme, that to highlight the heinousness of what the person has done, and that this is a person who should not be shown much mercy, at least in terms of this. No, it's just, you see that yes. We're used to seeing this theme in the secular legal world as well. The
callousness
yes.
reveals that the conscience is not working properly. That they not only committed the act, but they really did not feel any remorse at having committed the act. And indeed, that's the problem with the episode with the brothers and Joseph, is that having left him to die, remember this is before they even sold him, they really were perfectly fine with what they had done. They were not regretting it, they were not wondering if it was the right idea, they were okay. They could sit down and have a meal. and that callousness indeed is still a major component in secular courts as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we will call it there for today. A reminder again, there is no class next Wednesday because I am taking the day off to spend one of the days of spring break with my family and kids. So I will see you in 2 weeks' time. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. Excellent class. Thank you.
Thank you.